Welcome back to another installment of What's the Deal with Vouchers? In this video, we're tackling the question, will education savings accounts help public schools and their students? So last time we talked about the conditions under which an ESA might improve outcomes for a child whose family took advantage of it and moved the child to a different educational setting outside of the public system. But remember, the state is responsible for ensuring a general diffusion of knowledge and maintaining an efficient system of public free schools. So that means we also need to think about how a potential ESA policy will impact public schools and the students they serve, not just the students who might be leaving the system. Because there are always going to be students who remain in the public school instead of moving to another setting. The private school sector is not nearly large enough to handle all 5.1 million of our state's public school students, nor do they need to or intend to. So we've got to be thinking about the impacts of the policy on both sides. Okay, I watched an excellent debate on this, sponsored by or led by the Texas Tribune the other day. All the panelists were amazing and made very articulate arguments. And this was like front and center in the conversation. So the core argument of folks who are against voucher type policies is that diverting funds from public schools or, opening up the possibility for students to leave in large numbers will cause irreversible damage to public schools. Now, supporters of these policies say that's ridiculous, and they argue that ESAs will only result in marginal changes. A few students will move here and there, but there won't be a mass exodus. They also argue that public schools will actually be better off under an ESA policy because they'll have incentive to innovate and improve, so families will choose not to leave. So which is it? Before I talk about the research on this, just a quick aside. To me, it feels like there's a bit of a contradiction in those two supporting arguments for vouchers and ESAs. So on the one hand, we're saying the threat of losing students and funding will incentivize public schools to work harder to deliver what students and parents need and want. But at the same time, we're saying, well, it's not actually going to damage public schools' bottom lines in any significant way. Don't worry about it. It's hard for me to see how both of those things can be true. Either there's a significant threat to the school and they shape up, or there isn't, in which case they don't have a reason to improve their quality. So if you're a voucher ESA supporter and you have a good answer to that, write in, because I've just been thinking about that and feel like I don't have maybe a clear idea there. Okay, so once again, I'll share links to more detail on the research down below, looking at how public schools are affected by voucher policies. But once again, the bottom line is it really depends on the policy, the way it's designed, and the conditions in which it's implemented. There are studies that point to modestly positive effects of competition on public school quality. So there is a world in which knowing parents have the option to leave can push public schools to improve their communication and their community relations, expand their offerings, maybe crack down harder on ineffective teachers. That's kind of what was suggested in the analyses that I read. And those are the kinds of things that make economists really excited, right? It's like the power of the free market and people voting with their feet. It's great. But there also is a potential world in which an ESA policy really could gut a public school system. So I'll talk more about public school funding in another video, but basically public schools in Texas are funded based on their average daily attendance. So that means when they lose students, they lose funding. And if it's just like marginal change here and there, probably not a big deal. But there is a point at which a school can lose so many students and so much funding that it doesn't have the resources to make meaningful improvements for the students who are still there. Just like mathematically and the way funding works, that is a possibility. So what might make the difference and what actually would happen in Texas were we to pass an ESA policy? I think supply and demand are what's important to think about here. So in a community where most parents are happy with their public school, probably won't be a lot of students moving. And so the effect of an ESA policy on public schools, probably minimal. And the same is true in a community where there just aren't a lot of like private and independent providers. There's not a lot of alternatives. So you wouldn't expect to see a lot of students moving there. Not a big deal. But in a community where the public schools are struggling, or at least perceived to be struggling by the public, or if there's like significant demand for like really highly individualized, tailored options that a public school can't realistically provide, And if there are a lot of viable alternatives for families to access with an ESA, you could reasonably expect to see quite a bit of movement, which means public school budgets would take a hit. So I can certainly imagine things playing out either way. And honestly, chances are if we passed an ESA policy across the entire state of Texas, which again is huge and has a lot of variation, I wouldn't be surprised if like every possible outcome played out somewhere in the state. Um, just one more thought here. Out of the two voices in this debate, folks who support vouchers and ESAs typically represent like private and independent and homeschooling organizations, as you would expect. And these folks have less to lose here. So if more funding and more students come their way because of this new policy, that's great. That helps them. But they still get to hang on to their right to turn away students that they don't have capacity to serve. And if the policy doesn't make a big dent and students generally stay where they are and don't come, that's just kind of the status quo for right now. I don't see that as like being any big skin off their backs. In contrast, public schools do stand to lose quite a bit in the worst case scenario where this policy really does trigger a mass exodus of students. Unlike privates, they do continue to have an obligation to serve any and all students who come their way. That's going to get harder and harder to do well if that loss triggers significant budget cuts. So even if we don't think it's likely that that will happen, it's such a significant risk that we really need to err on the side of caution here and not move forward with an ESA policy if there's a real possibility that it could cause harm. And even if we're pretty confident that it won't, the safest thing to do is to make provisions to keep public school budgets steady or at least in a controlled decline if they really do lose a significant number of students once ESAs are introduced. There are a few ways that the legislature could do this, like writing in a hold harmless clause or baking in a mechanism for like offsetting that funding loss. But if we don't do that, we're going to be making it impossible for these schools to continue doing their jobs for the kids that they still have. Okay, so takeaway here is for any ESA policy that our legislature considers in this session, we need to be asking, how will this policy impact public schools and the students they serve? If the answer is it could have a negative impact or we don't know, it's not the right policy for us.